our boxes are being delivered this minute. Well, I guess we should say they were delivered both a day early and they were packed. They did the Cleveland packing for the Portland delivery and the Portland packing for they reversed how the packing should be. So we got some 10-foot tall pallets that cannot go off a truck with a lift gate. And yeah, they're designed for a forklift, which they did not bring. So anyway.
Hi, I'm Joe Biel, the founder and CEO of Microcosm Publishing. I'm also the author of A People's Guide to Publishing, which distills what I've learned from selling millions of books over the past 28 years.
I'm Ellie Blue, the Vice President of Microcosm. We started this podcast to share what we've learned with newer publishers, so you can learn from our mistakes. Or maybe you just want to learn about the publishing industry.
Should I be talking about something other than boxes?
And you can talk about boxes all you want, but the purpose of this meeting is to talk about budgeting.
Oh, we're talking about budgeting in this one. Okay. Sounds good. 3 important details here that basically make or break this for functioning for someone. Those things are being organized. There's a psychological term about the person's aversion to actually knowing the reality of their finances, their budget, their personal finance, because that is such a common problem that people are so paralyzed by knowing their situation that they reject that information. So that's the first third of your power, is knowing what your situation is, because in most cases your situation, you at least have some of it, or it's better than you realize. And because if there's a problem, you're likely aware of it already. So there's very few surprises, and most of the surprises that happen are positive surprises. And then it's knowing what you want is sort of almost the most important aspect. So for some people, that's paying off their debts, or not paying serviced interest that isn't getting you where you want to go, or a lot of times people end up in taking on a lot of debt at a certain point in their life, and then getting out of that is difficult and complicated. And so creating a plan for that. Or for some people at a different point in life, it's planning or saving for retirement, or it's planning for and owning a first home, or things like that. So it's different kinds of things depending on what your goals are. And so you have to be the one that sets your own goals for your own personal finance, because it just works better that way. Because when you're the one making the plan, then you won't resent the plan, and you're much more inclined to work in conjunction with yourself towards your goals rather than somebody else's goals. And a lot of it is getting rid of family of origin voices, or stuff that's baggage that you've accumulated through life about what's best for you, because it's what's best for you is what you want, is just a much better approach, and then if you set the agenda, it's much more likely that you'll achieve the agenda. So, and then sort of third is looking at, if you're getting out of the thing, what you're putting into the thing. So for example, maybe you really love decadent groceries. It's going to be worth it for you to spend more on that, or to have daily fancy coffee drink, or than it would be for somebody that isn't actually appreciating that but is spending on it anyway. So that's how it's sort of keep those 3 things in mind. And then there's a few different strategies. So first of all, we are going to get organized. As soon as I figure out how to share my screen again. Chrome tab, sample budget. There we go. All right. Did that work? Looks like it worked.
We can see it.
Fantastic. Okay. So, step 1, putting your numbers on a spreadsheet. You can literally go to File, make a copy, and then make your own version of this, and then put your own numbers on there. And you don't have to tell anybody about this. You don't have to share it with anybody. You don't want to. It's like, it almost works better that way, unless you want like an accountability buddy where you're like, I'm going to get my affairs in order this time. And then you do that. So part of the deal here is, finding out what the real numbers are. So like, what do you spend each month on utilities and your cell phone? And then, so like you put that over here starting in January in column S, and then you work backwards for each month. And then you have, an estimate for last year for what that was. And then you look at, and then you create a budget where you're like, what's a reasonable number for my utilities and my cell phone? Like, what is this? What am I actually paying? Is there any compression room? Do I get increased joy from running the heat a little hotter during the winter? Familiar? Well, full disclosure, I am under a electric blanket right now. And then, from there, you kind of look at, like, what are you getting out of that? Like, do you have wiggle room? Are you about right? Like, you don't have a ton of wiggle room usually with utilities, but, there's some. But, you're not like going to be saving a bundle there. And then, things like home repairs, and that could be something like, like it's cool to get a new kitchen table sometimes. It's like, these aren't necessarily like major expenditures, but these are like sometimes major quality of life improvements, or, just like things to make you happy. And then similarly, if you pay taxes outside of your paycheck or outside of, other things, then, or if you're like responsible to pay different kinds of taxes, you put that as a line item. And then rent, mortgage, that's pretty self-explanatory. I do, usually this is like a one-on-one thing. So I do run into people where I am occasionally horrified to learn how much they pay in rent. And that is a fairly immediate thing that needs resolved, because they've like, a lot of times what happens is people like get into a place and they couldn't have afforded it in the first place. And like, so letting go and moving on is a whole big emotional turmoil, because that's part of it too. It's like, maybe your apartment does give you $2,500 worth of joy every month, but you may not have $2,500 a month to put into your apartment. So there's that. And that's like being honest with yourself. And then if we can back up like a little bit, so like if you have joint finances with a partner, obviously you could do this together with both of your incomes, or you could do this separately, or you could, but if you obviously have independent finances, then you'd want to think about it that way. But if you budget together, it can be a good exercise to do together, as well as a good thing to have as a discussion item when, but then you have to deal with what gives the other person that amount of joy, and if they're getting out of it what they're putting into it, and then you by extension are also putting into it. So homeowners insurance, renters insurance, same thing if you have that. If you don't, obviously that is a zero, or in a lot of cases, it's like bundled into the mortgage or otherwise. So, in a lot of cases, that's a zero unless separated out. And then health insurance premiums, that's like what you pay regardless of whether or not you use it. And that one probably has the least wiggle room of them all, other than not having health insurance, or I guess you can get the more. Sometimes you can scale up, and then like what you pay out of pocket for actual services. So like I go to the doctor like 4 times a week, so each one of those is like another $30 or $40 out of pocket on top of that. So that adds up probably the most. But then there's like weird things sometimes where like yesterday my appointment had like a $22 credit on it for no reason. So then I only had to pay $7 and something. So this is why like healthcare out of pocket is the kind of expense where if you just off the top of your head were like, oh, I pay about this amount of money, like you're probably going to be wrong, because that's something that's really hard to estimate. So it actually can be really valuable to add it up every month and look at what you're actually paying, because you'll often be surprised. And it's really like 50-50. Like half the people that I work with one-on-one, they dramatically overestimate all of their expenses, and half the people like conservatively underestimate all of their expenses. And both are kind of equally bad, because you need to know what you're actually spending, because that's the only way to make a budget. And and you need to know when like an expense is an outlier, versus like a monthly expense. So travel, bus, Lyft, that's like separate from your other transportation budget. And then therapy, that's like similar. That's like out of pocket, or if you pay that as a deductible from your insurance, you could put that into healthcare out of pocket. But I separated it here because I think for most people, they don't think of that in the same bucket. And then dues and subscriptions, that's things like Netflix and Hulu and like anything that you subscribe to. Anything if you have like a video game that has like a monthly charge, or like any kind of fun thing, that entertainment, let's say. And then books, you could say movies, you could say anything else that's like a one-time cost here, versus dues and subscriptions would be recurring charges. Professional education is kind of self-explanatory also. For a lot of people that's like $0, and for a lot of people that's like $200. So it all depends on what kind of continuing personal enrichment education you've got going on in your own life. And then computer software, also pretty self-explanatory. For most people, that's like once every few years, and then repairs, and so like your monthly often will feel like $0, but you want to make sure that it's actually $0. And then so that's like one of those expenses where it's like a major inconvenience when you need to get a new computer, because people don't like think of that as like part of their budget. So one thing you can do there is to like amortize that out, to be like, okay, if a computer lasts 5 years and it costs this much money and it takes this many repairs, like how much am I actually budgeting for a computer? And like how much of that will get me ahead if I like round that up by $5? Some people like to give money to nonprofits and charities. And then miscellaneous, you can obviously change things like miscellaneous to whatever if you have other things. And then this might tell you more about the kind of people that I often workshop with. Plants is an expense category, as are pets, dogs and cats. And then, like we discussed before, groceries can be a big one, especially these last 4 years. Youch. That's seemingly the thing that is like most reported on in the news is like what groceries cost compared to 2019. Going back down, it's the good news. You don't often see numbers that go back down, so there's a small comfort. Excellent topical humor, Ellie. And then, so clothes, that can be everything from like buying new clothes, buying used clothes, laundry, cleaning your clothes, things like that. How well styled is like, and how much joy do you get out of spending X amount of dollars on clothes is like really the question. Same thing with home goods. You know, some people roll that into groceries because they buy them at the same place at the same time. I leave that up to you. Writers have this terrible suffering reality called submission fees, where they're expected to pay to be published, which is a horror show that I protest strongly, but is something that people really believe in. Yes, an excellent point. For a lot of different kinds of people can write off any sort of purchased media as a tax deduction. So that's another thing. We don't get thoroughly into that here, but that can really help in the end to have a good tax preparer. And I would point out to most everyone is if you have any kind of sideline, if you like even do any amount of freelancing, then that opens up a lot of different deductions that you can take. That is not tax advice. That is just information. And then similarly, car transportation, that can be a whopper. That there's like pretty wild amounts of variance there because it's like, it depends, what your monthly repairs are. It depends what your payment is. It depends what, you're spending on gas. And that can be dramatically different. Oh, interesting. So Kaylin's accountant has very different advice, whereas our accountant said basically that any media purchased qualifies as research-based spending because you're like going to analyze it through the lens of your employment. So, go make decisions based on that because it's like, obviously when you work in publishing, every book you read is in fact research. So, and then of course, similarly, it's a little, if you have like a car lease or, a 5-year loan on a car payment, obviously that's going to be pretty different than, if you have a used car that needs a lot of like routine repairs. And I had a friend's dad growing up that pointed out the like kind of crushing reality that was like, you even, if you're spending $300 a month on your car payment, and $300 a month is probably like low for a car payment in 2024. He was like, you're never going to spend $300 a month on car repairs. You're never going to do that. It's going to feel like you do it every single month, but you probably don't do it actually every single month. And I was like, oh, wow, that's like ideologically not something I had even thought of at that time. So, it's harder to get out of a situation like that, but it's, this is the kind of thing where, if you're not getting the amount of joy out of any line item, that's something where you want to like think about it, And joy can just be like convenience. Joy can be like, utility, versatility. Like if like going to the mountains every weekend is your thing, then, that's valuable to you. And then similarly, gifts, that can be like gifts for friends, gifts for, that's like not a tax deductible gift. That's like I'm spending money because it brings people joy. And now we have the arguably most or least fun part, depending on how you are approaching this exercise. So most people have a certain amount of debts. I itemized 5 sample debts here. I just called them student loans and debts 1 through 4. Whereas like if you were to populate this, you would say like car loan, mortgage, credit card bill, you'd like call them what they were called. And then you can fill in the actual percentage of like what your interest is. And then I think this was like a free for 24 months one. I think student loans was like when, it was frozen. I don't know if it's still frozen. Maybe it's still frozen for some people and not others. Hard to get concrete up to the minute information and stuff like that. And so, but then on other loans, you'll see like rates are going way, way up, so there's 2 different approaches here. Well, there's more than 2 different approaches here, but there's 2 that I usually say, like, pick the one that works best for you. For some people, the best thing to do, well, like materially, the best thing to do may be to pay off the loan first that has the highest interest rate, because then, that just benefits you in the shortest term. And what I run into a lot is people putting money into savings that is not necessarily doing anything for them, instead of paying off these like expensive loans. So honestly, you're usually better off, and I made a little comparison chart here where you can put in like the interest rate on your savings account in A38, and then it'll actually figure out, like, based on the amount of money in there, like what is happening. But so, like, for example, in this case, this person that has $16,000 in savings, they would be tremendously better off paying off debts 2 and 3 than having this money in the bank, because that's going to save them, several $1,000s a year every single year. And like for some people, they need that money for like peace of mind. And so again, the question is, am I getting out of it what I'm putting into it? So like that's the question to have with yourself in private, in, a trusting space. And then, but for some people, the best thing to do is if they have like a whole ton of loans, it can just feel really good to get the letter in the mail that like your loan is paid off. So in that case, you would pay off the smallest loan up to the largest loan, and there's all kinds of different psychological approaches for all these different methods. So again, it's like what works for you. What do you want? What are you getting out of it? Like what's like the incentivizing, rewarding behavior that like gives you the endorphins when you're like, would you rather have one fewer thing to worry about, or would you rather owe less money over the course of the year? And that's like, obviously you want both, but, given that choice, which one is going to feel more rewarding today? And maybe your answer changes next month, and that's okay too. It's just like you have to, having all the numbers on the sheet here is important, because then you're making a deliberate choice rather than like an anxious choice or like a rash choice that isn't necessarily serving your goals. And the other advantage here is that with all your numbers in front of you, you can say, okay, like my monthly income, my total expenses, I have another $275 a month to allocate somewhere. Like I should spend that on something else. So like I'll spend it on this loan. I think that's right. Yes. And then that alone, it's just, we didn't portion this one, so we can't see the benefits of that. Well, I'll do it. I'll redo that briefly so you can see the impact of that. So you can see in line 32 here, this is like the monthly interest on this now. And then, did it not change? How did it not? Oh, because it's over here. Right. So this is, I was trying to have a dramatic moment of flair, but I need to manually change each of these apparently. And so this is, and the other thing that's kind of interesting, which I hadn't really given a lot of thought to until today, is that the length of the month determines how much interest you pay. So like, it's not just that you pay interest on the interest, it's that the extra 1 day in the month could mean that you pay more interest. If you're making minimum payments, you're not going to be inching it down because the interest is going to be fighting you up faster than you're reducing the total amount of the debt. And so a lot of cases, that's sort of the other thing that you want to look at. So these went down about, it's about $15 at the beginning of the year. And then by the end of the year, you're saving, about $25 a month. So that's like and you're working down the debt. So, and then in some cases, like I had somebody that had a little bit of a different situation where there was an asset, but the asset was owned by the bank until it was paid off. So we figured out that if we put all of the loan payments, if we paid minimums on everything else, and then paid the maximum left on that, then that asset could be then sold, and then that actually would entirely pay off 2 other debts. And that was, a moment of ingenuitive thinking. And so that can be interesting too, where I wouldn't have known that if it hadn't been shared with me, so things like that make a difference too. So, and again, it's like for some people, it's really more valuable to have the savings and like have a little bit of money in the bank, because otherwise it's just too nerve-wracking for some people if they don't. But honestly, the last like 17, 18 years, the way interest rates have been, it's really disincentivized savings. It's like been so cheap to borrow money that it's almost been better to do that. But now we've been shifting in the other direction where like you can actually get better interest rates if you put money in the bank, which it's been, honestly, I was kind of wondering if that would ever happen again. And so, you can like make your decisions based on that. So it's going to get more expensive to borrow. And then, so like, sometimes, in some cases, what will make sense is like bundling all of your loans. So like you go to somebody, a lender, and you say, I owe this amount of money in total. What can you do for me if we put it all as one loan and then I pay you off and I don't like continue borrowing against it? And sometimes that can be significantly cheaper because you won't have all of these monthly interest rates being so astronomical. Like you can normally get interest rates closer to that of debt 4. So, and then, in some cases, you can get cards with 0% interest, but you want to like outflank the bank, because what they're betting on is that you're going to have a giant balance when interest suddenly comes due. And in a lot of cases, they will back bill you all of that interest. So you want to have another 0% card lined up for that moment, or not to need to borrow that money anymore. So a bunch of things that can be done there. But really, the question is forever, like, what do you want out of it? Like, where's your goals being best serviced, So, and then this is other, incomes, net. And then this is like if you have income that's variable, month to month, so you'd want to look at that. But yeah, that's the basic nuts and bolts part. So again, it's like figure out what you want, like what's important to you, organize all your information, figure out, like where you're spending more than you realize, and then like figure out where you're spending more than you're getting for what you're spending. And then, figure out what your strategy is going to be. And a lot of times it's going to feel, depending on like, it's hard to really put this into words because of that, like so much of it is psychological, emotional components. But, at 20 years ago, like I was in so much debt that I was like, how this is just always going to be this way. And then somehow over time you just like turn a corner almost magically and you're like, oh, that's like the numbers were getting smaller all the time, so it's interesting because things that feel insurmountable, like you can keep them remaining insurmountable, or like you can make a plan and figure out that part and then execute on that plan. So what you want, putting all the information in front of you, and then executing on that. And it's not like, like there's no get rich quick secrets. It's more about like what matters the most to you, like what do you want out of life, So that's the basics. Maybe, yes, retirement savings, something I do not have. But yes, I totally, yeah. And it's like one of those things, but then you like, if you're working on it, then you're working on it, and like, maybe that's not a priority or it doesn't feel urgent yet. Honestly, in most cases, getting out from under any high interest debts is going to reward you more for retirement than putting money in the bank is for retirement. But then you'll turn a corner and figure out what you want to do a little bit later on.
Thanks for joining us once again.
Please send your questions to podcast@microcosmpublishing.com so we can answer them on future episodes.
And please give us 5 stars on iTunes and everywhere else that podcasts are reviewed.
You can find us on the internet at microcosm.pub,
on Twitter at Microcosm,
on Facebook at Microcosm Publishing,
on Instagram at Microcosm_pub,
and here in Portland, Oregon on North Williams Avenue.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful week.